Hello friends, if you want to watch super hit movie Pretty Woman in English, then you must like this video. If you are visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel friends in today's video. The movie we're going to talk about is called Pretty Woman. We will talk about what this movie is and where you can watch it, all the interesting facts about this movie in today's video. I'm going to tell you, I also going to give you all the information on which platform or on which satellite channel you will get to watch this movie. Also, we will talk in detail about the technical department, music department, pre-production filming, post-production budget, box office collection of this film. We will also talk about the story of this film, and I will also give you a small review of the story of this film. Apart from this, we will discuss about the facts of this film storyline, star cast, actors' performance in the film, and which character has played which role. That's why I request you friends to watch this video till the ends. So let's start the video. Pretty Woman is a 1990 American romantic comedy film directed by Garry from a screenplay by J.F. Lawton. The film stars Richard Gere and Julia Roberts and features Hector Elizondo, Ralph Bellamy in his final performance, Laura San Giacomo, and Jason Alexander in supporting roles. The film's story centers on Hollywood escort Vivian Ward and wealthy businessman Edward Lewis. Vivian is hired to be Edward's escort for several business and social functions, and their relationship develops during her week-long stay with him. The film's title, Pretty Woman, is based on the 1964 song, Oh, Pretty Woman, by Roy Orbison. The original screenplay was titled 3000 and was written by then-struggling screenwriter J.F. Lawton. Originally intended to be a dark cautionary tale about class and sex work in Los Angeles, the film was reconceived as a romantic comedy with a large budget. Pretty Woman received mixed reviews from critics upon release, but widespread praise was directed towards Roberts' performance and her chemistry with Gere. It saw the highest number of ticket sales in the U.S. ever for a romantic comedy, with Box Office Mojo listing it as the #1 romantic comedy by the highest estimated domestic tickets sold at 42,176,400, slightly ahead of My Big Fat Greek Wedding, 2002, at 41,409,500 tickets. The film grossed $463.4 million worldwide, and at the time of its release was the 5th highest-grossing film of all time worldwide, behind only E.T. The Extraterrestrial, $701 million at the time, Star Wars, $530 million at the time, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, $474 million at the time, and Jaws, $470 million at the time. It was also the highest-grossing R-rated film released by Walt Disney Studios, holding the record for 34 years until Marvel Studios' Deadpool and Wolverine surpassed it in 2024. Pretty Woman catapulted Roberts to superstardom, earning her the Golden Globe Award for Best Actress, Motion Picture, Comedy, or Musical, in addition to her first nominations for the Academy Award for Best Actress and the BAFTA Award for Best Actress in a Leading Role. The film also received nominations for the BAFTA Award for Best Film and the Golden Globe Award for Best Motion Picture, Musical, or Comedy. Plot. One night, while leaving a business party in the Hollywood Hills, Edward takes his lawyer, Philip's Lotus Esprit, and finds himself in the red light district on Hollywood Boulevard, where he meets prostitute Vivian Ward. Lost and struggling to operate the stick shift, Vivian offers to drive Edward to the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Impulsively, he hires her for the whole night, and despite initial awkwardness, finds her charming, and they have sex in his penthouse suite. The following day, Edward asks Vivian to stay for the week, as he must attend a series of business events while attempting to acquire Jim Morse's shipbuilding company. After negotiating, Edward and Vivian agree on $3,000. He also gives her money to buy appropriate clothes. However, when trying to shop on Rodeo Drive, snobbish and rude saleswomen turn Vivian away. She asks the hotel manager Barney for assistance. He gets upscale store sales lady Bridget, who is very kind, to find her a cocktail dress for that evening's business dinner. Later, Barney teaches her table etiquette. Edward is astounded by Vivian's transformation. At dinner, he introduces Vivian to Morse and his grandson David, who is to take over the company. The Morses are charmed by her, but ultimately the dinner does not go well as they are unhappy with Edward's plan to dismantle their company. Edward opens up to the transformed Vivian. He reveals details about his personal and business life, including his estranged relationship with his late father Carter. Edward takes Vivian along as his date to a polo match. When Philip sees Vivian talking to David Morse, he tells Edward his suspicions that she is a corporate spy. Edward dismisses Philip's concerns by explaining their arrangement. With the knowledge of Vivian's true background, the married Philip goes to talk to her alone and crudely propositions her for her services. Back in Edward's suite, Vivian gets upset with Edward for exposing her in that way. He apologizes, admitting that he was jealous of Vivian talking to David and acknowledging that her directness is having a positive effect on him. Edward takes Vivian by private jet to see La Traviata at the San Francisco Opera, a story about a prostitute who falls in love with a wealthy man. She is moved, and she breaks her no-kissing rule before having sex with him. Believing Edward has fallen asleep, Vivian says she loves him. As the week is almost finished, Edward offers to get Vivian a condominium and an allowance, promising to visit her regularly. However, Vivian is offended, feeling he is now treating her like a prostitute. She shares her childhood fantasy of being rescued by a knight on a white steed. Edward meets with Morse, but, influenced by Vivian, chooses to work with him to save his company instead of dismantling it. Meanwhile, Philip, furious that Edward's new direction has cost him a fortune, goes to the Beverly Wilshire to confront him. However, he finds Vivian. So, blaming her for Edward's changes and angry at his business decision, Philip hits her and attempts to rape her. Edward arrives, pulls Philip off of Vivian, punches, and fires him. After completing his business in Los Angeles, Edward asks Vivian to stay with him for one more night, but only if she wants to, not because he is paying her. She gently refuses and leaves after telling him she thinks he has lots of special gifts. Vivian returns to her apartment hotel to pack for her move to San Francisco to get a new job and finish her high school degree. She gives her roommate, fellow prostitute Kit DeLuca, some money and tells her she has a lot of potential. Kit leaves sex work and enrolls in beauty classes. Vivian then waits in her apartment for the bus. Vivian's rejection prompts Edward to reevaluate his life, so he reroutes the chauffeur to her apartment instead of the airport. He climbs out of the white limousine's sunroof and ascends the fire escape to rescue Vivian, just like the knight in her childhood fantasy. When he asks her what happens after the knight rescues her, she responds, she rescues him right back and kisses him. Cast. As per the opening credits, Richard Gere as Edward Lewis, a rich corporate raider from New York who hires Vivian to be his escort for a week. Julia Roberts as Vivian Ward, a free-spirited Hollywood prostitute. Ralph Bellamy as Jim Morse, owner of Morse Industries, a troubled shipbuilding company Edward plans to take over. Jason Alexander as Philip Stuckey, Edward's insensitive lawyer. Hector Elizondo as Barnard Barney Thompson, the dignified and soft-hearted hotel manager. Laura San Giacomo as Kit DeLuca, Vivian's sarcastic, wisecracking best friend and roommate who taught her the prostitution trade. Alex Hyde White as David Morse, Jim Morse's grandson, who is being groomed to take over the Morse's shipbuilding company. Amy Yazbek as Elizabeth Stuckey, Philip's wife. Eleanor Donahue as Bridget, a friend of Barney Thompson who works in a women's clothing store. John David Carson as Mark Roth, a businessman in Edward's office. Judith Baldwin as Susan, one of Edward's ex-girlfriends whom he runs into at Phil's party at the beginning of the film. She has recently married, and Edward's secretary was a bridesmaid. Patrick Richwood as night elevator operator Dennis. James Patrick Stewart as Dennis Rowland, the day bellhop. Day Young as a snobbish saleswoman in a clothing store. Larry Miller as Mr. Hollister, the manager of a clothing store where Vivian buys her new wardrobe. Hank Azaria as a detective, film debut. Jason Randall as a magician. Production. Development. The film was initially conceived as a dark drama about prostitution in Los Angeles in the 1980s. 4. The relationship between Vivian and Edward also originally included Vivian being addicted to drugs. Part of the deal was that she had to stay off cocaine for a week. Edward eventually throws her out of his car and drives off. The original script by J.F. Lawton, called 3006, ended with Vivian and her prostitute friend on the bus to Disneyland. Producer Laura Ziskin considered these elements detrimental to a sympathetic portrayal of Vivian, and they were removed or assigned to Kit. The deleted scenes have been found, and some were included on the DVD released for the film's 15th anniversary. 4. In one, Vivian tells Edward, "I could just pop you good and be on my way," indicating her lack of interest in pillow talk. In another, she is confronted by a drug dealer, Carlos, then rescued by Edward when the limo driver Daryl gets his gun out. Though inspired by such films as Wall Street and The Last Detail, the film bears a resemblance to Pygmalion myths, particularly George Bernard Shaw's play of the same name, which also formed the basis for the Broadway musical My Fair Lady. It was Walt Disney Studios' then president Jeffrey Katzenberg who insisted the film be rewritten as a modern-day fairy tale and love story, as opposed to the original dark drama. It was pitched to Touchstone Pictures and rewritten as a romantic comedy. The title 3000 was changed because Disney executives thought it sounded like a title for a science fiction film. Casting. The casting of the film was a rather lengthy process. Marshall had initially considered Christopher Reeve, Daniel Day-Lewis, Kevin Kline, and Denzel Washington for the role of Edward, and Albert Brooks, Sylvester Stallone, Christopher Lambert, Al Pacino, and Burt Reynolds turned it down. Pacino went as far as doing a casting reading with Roberts before rejecting the part. Sam Neill, Tom Conti, and Charles Grodin tested for the part along with Roberts. Garry initially refused, but when he met with Roberts, she persuaded him and he eventually agreed to play Lewis. He reportedly started off much more active in his role, but Garry Marshall took him aside and said, "No, no, no, Richard. In this movie, one of you moves and one of you does not. Guess which one you are." Julia Roberts was not the first choice for the role of Vivian and was not wanted by Disney. Many other actresses were considered. Marshall originally envisioned Karen Allen for the role. When she declined, auditions went to many better-known actresses of the time, including Molly Ringwald, who turned it down as she didn't like the story as she felt there was something icky about it. Winona Ryder auditioned, but was turned down because Marshall felt she was too young. Jennifer Connelly was also dismissed for the same reason. Emily Lloyd turned it down as it conflicted with her shooting for the film Mermaids. Drew Barrymore, Patricia Arquette, Brooke Shields, Uma Thurman, and Kristen Davis also auditioned for the role of Vivian. Meg Ryan, who was the studio and Marshall's top choice, turned it down as well. According to a note written by Marshall, Mary Steenburgen was also among the first choices. Diane Lane came very close to being cast. The script was much darker at the time. They had gone as far as costume fittings, but due to scheduling conflicts, she could not accept. Michelle Pfeiffer turned the role down, saying she did not like the script's tone. Daryl Hannah was also considered, but believed the role was degrading to women. Valeria Golino was in consideration, but was not selected because of her thick Italian accent, and Jennifer Jason Leigh had auditioned. Leah Thompson unsuccessfully auditioned for the role, as she thought the film was a drama. When all the other actresses turned down the role, 21-year-old Julia Roberts, a relative unknown, with only the sleeper hit Mystic Pizza, 1988, and the yet-to-be-released Steel Magnolias, 1989, for which she would be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, won the role of Vivian. Her performance made her a star. J.F. Lawton, writer of the original screenplay, has suggested that the film was ultimately given a happy ending because of the chemistry of Gere and Roberts. Veteran actor Ralph Bellamy, who plays James Morse, appears in his final acting performance before his death in 1991. Jason Alexander, who had also recently been cast for his role as the bumbling George Costanza in Seinfeld, was cast as Philip Stuckey. A VHS copy of Pretty Woman would appear in Seinfeld's apartment in later seasons of Seinfeld as a homage to Alexander's participation in the film. Filming. The film's budget was substantial, at $14 million, so producers could shoot in many locations. Most filming took place in Los Angeles, California, specifically in Beverly Hills, and inside soundstages at Walt Disney Studios in Burbank. The escargot scene at the restaurant was shot at Rex 2 Ristorante, now named Cicada. Scenes set in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel lobby were shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Filming commenced on July 24, 1989, but was immediately plagued by problems. These included Ferrari and Porsche declining the product placement opportunity for the car Edward drove, as neither firm wished to be associated with prostitutes. Lotus Cars saw the placement value and supplied a silver 1989 plus 1/2 Esprit SE, which was later sold. Filming was a generally pleasant, easygoing experience, as the budget was broad and the shooting schedule was not tight. While shooting the scene where Vivian is lying down on the floor of Edward's penthouse, watching reruns of I Love Lucy, Garry Marshall had to tickle Robert's feet out of camera range to get her to laugh. The scene in which Gere playfully snaps the lid of a jewelry case on her fingers was improvised, and her surprised laugh was genuine. The red dress Vivian wears to the opera has been listed among the most unforgettable dresses of all time. During the scene in which Robert sang a Prince song in the bathtub, slid down, and submerged her head under the bubbles, she emerged to find the crew had left, except for the cameraman, who captured the moment on film. In the love scene, she was so stressed that a vein became noticeable on her forehead and had to be massaged by Marshall and Gere. She also developed a case of hives, and calamine lotion was used to soothe her skin until filming resumed. Shelley Michelle acted as body double for Roberts in risque scenes in the film's publicity poster. Filming wrapped on October 18, 1989. Reception. Box office. In its opening weekend, the film was at number 1 at the U.S. box office, grossing $11,280,591 and averaging $8,513 per theater. Despite dropping to number 2 in its second weekend, it grossed more with $12,471,635. It returned to number 1 at the U.S. box office in its sixth weekend and was number 1 for 3 weeks. It was in the top 10 movies in the U.S. for 16 weeks. In Australia, it was number 1 for 12 weeks and was number 1 for 9 consecutive weeks in the UK. As of September 29, 2009, it has grossed $178,406,268 in the United States and $285,000 in other countries, for a total worldwide gross of $463,406,268. It was the 4th highest-grossing film of the year in the United States and Canada, and the 3rd highest-grossing worldwide. The film was Disney's highest-grossing film ever, surpassing Three Men and a Baby. It was also Disney's highest-grossing R-rated release until Deadpool and Wolverine surpassed it in 2024. It is the 4th highest-grossing romantic comedy film to date. Critical response. Pretty Woman received mixed reviews from critics, with positive reviews praising the star's chemistry and the dialogue. On review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating of 65% based on 77 reviews, with an average rating of 6.010. The website's critical consensus states, Pretty Woman may be a yuppie fantasy, but the film's slick comedy, soundtrack, and casting can overcome misgivings. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 51 out of 100, based on 18 critics, indicating mixed or average reviews. Audiences polled by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of A on an A+ to F scale. The film's detractors criticized the overuse of the hooker with a heart of gold trope. Others opined that the film sugarcoats the realities of sex work. Gary Giddens wrote, "In the insidious Pretty Woman, all women who aren't explicitly identified as tramps are gold-digging wives or snooty shopkeepers. It's the kind of working-class fantasy that wants the men in the audience to identify with a ruthless corporate pirate, Richard Gere, and the woman to identify with a simple but grand-hearted streetwalker, Julia Roberts, who, given a chance, could be a ladies' lady. The attempted laughs, few succeed, are at her expense." Owen Gleiberman of Entertainment Weekly gave the film a D, saying it starts out as a neo-Pygmalion comedy and becomes a plastic screwball soap opera, with the kinds of characters who exist nowhere but in the minds of callowly manipulative Hollywood screenwriters. Gleiberman conceded that with the film's tough hooker heroine, it can work as a feminist version of an upscale princess fantasy. He also said it pretends to be about how love transcends money, but is really obsessed with status symbols. On the film's 20th anniversary, Gleiberman wrote another article addressing his original review, saying that while he felt some of his criticisms were valid, he would have given it a B today. Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times gave a positive review, praising how the film is about a particularly romantic kind of love, the sort you hardly see in the movies these days. He added it protects its fragile love story in the midst of cynicism and compromise. The performances are critical for that purpose. Gere plays new notes here. His swagger is gone, and he's more tentative, proper, even shy. Roberts does an interesting thing. She gives her character an irrepressibly bouncy sense of humor and then lets her spend the movie trying to repress it. Actresses who can do that and look great can have whatever they want in Hollywood. The New York Times' Janet Maslin wrote, "Despite this quintessentially late 80s outlook, and despite a covetousness and underlying misogyny that bring Mr. Marshall's earlier Overboard to mind, Pretty Woman manages to be giddy, light-hearted escapism much of the time." Ms. Roberts, as noted, is a complete knockout, and this performance will make her a major star. Mr. Gere is mildly constrained by the button-down aspects of Edward's character, but he manages to be dapper, amusing, and the perfect foil. Though it has not been that long since he himself was on the other side of the Hollywood gigolo equation, he conveys a dignity and presence well-suited to a soon-to-be radicalized captain of industry. Karina Chocano of the New York Times said the movie wasn't a love story, it was a money story. Its logic depended on a disconnect between character and narrative, between image and meaning, between money and value, and that made it not cluelessly traditional, but thoroughly postmodern. In a 2019 interview, Roberts expressed uncertainty over whether the film could be made today due to its controversial premise, commenting, "So many things you could poke a hole in, but I don't think it takes away from people being able to enjoy it." Music, main article, Pretty Woman, soundtrack. The soundtrack features the songs, among others, Oh, Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison, which inspired its title. Roxette's It Must Have Been Love, originally released in December 1987, reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in June 1990. King of Wishful Thinking by Go West. Show Me Your Soul by Red Hot Chili Peppers. No Explanation by Peter Cetera. Wild Women Do by Natalie Cole. Fallen by Lauren Wood. The soundtrack has been certified triple platinum by the Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA. The opera featured in the film is La Traviata, which also served as inspiration for its plot. The highly dramatic aria fragment that is repeated is the end of Dammi tu forza, Give Me Strength, from the opera. Roberts sings the song Kiss by Prince while she is in the tub and Gere's character is on the phone. Background music is composed by James Newton Howard. The piano piece Gere's character plays in the hotel lobby was composed and performed by Gere. Entitled He Sleeps Love Theme, this piano composition is inspired by Bruce Springsteen's Racing in the Street. Citation needed. Musical adaptation. Main article, Pretty Woman, musical. A stage musical adaptation of the film opened on Broadway on July 20, 2018, in previews, officially on August 16th at the Nederlander Theater. This follows an out-of-town tryout at the Oriental Theater in Chicago, which ran from March 13th to April 15th, 2018. The musical has music and lyrics by Bryan Adams and Jim Vallance. The late Garry Marshall and J.F. Lawton wrote the book, and Jerry Mitchell is the director and choreographer. The Chicago and Broadway cast featured Samantha Barks in her Broadway debut as Vivian and Steve Kazee as Edward. Barks finished her run as Vivian on July 21, 2019, and was replaced by Jillian Mueller the following evening, with Brennan Hunt, of Rent fame, assuming the role of Edward. Orphe portrayed Kit, and Jason Danieli played Philip Stuckey. Eric Anderson portrayed the role of Mr. Thompson, and Kingsley Leggs played the role of James Morse. The UK and Ireland stage musical tour commenced in the fall of 2023. The show opened in Bristol, with cast members Amber Davies as Vivian, Oliver Saville as Edward, or Oduba played Mr. Thompson. The run is scheduled to continue through most of 2024. Because Pretty Woman stars Richard Gere, Hollywood's most successful male sex symbol, and because it's about his character falling in love with a prostitute, it is astonishing that Pretty Woman is such an innocent movie, that it's the sweetest and most open-hearted love fable since The Princess Bride. Here is a movie that could have marched us down mean streets into the sinks of iniquity, and it glows with romance. Oh, it seems to be constructed out of the stuff of realism. All right, it stars Gere as an out-of-town millionaire visiting Los Angeles who borrows his friend's car and gets lost on Hollywood Boulevard. He asks a hooker for directions to his hotel. She offers to tell him for $5. For $10, she'll guide him there. He agrees. It is important to understand that he is looking for directions, not sex, and that he has broken up, coldly and efficiently, with his current girlfriend only half an hour earlier in a terse telephone conversation. The girl gets into the car, and it turns out that she knows a lot about cars. This intrigues him, and the result is that he invites her to join him in his hotel suite. But not for sex, of course, he says. But you still have to pay, of course, she says. She is played by Julia Roberts, Mystic Pizza, and an Oscar-nominated role in Steel Magnolias, as a woman who is as smart as she is attractive, which makes her very smart. Like many prostitutes, she is able to perform the mental trick of standing outside of what she does, of detaching herself and believing that her real self is not involved. That's what she does. She overhears one of his telephone conversations and wants to know what he does. He's a takeover artist. He buys companies, takes them apart, and sells the pieces for more than he paid for the whole. But what about the people who work for those companies? She wants to know. People have nothing to do with it, he explains. It's strictly business. Oh, she says, then you do the same thing I do. What is happening in these scenes is that the characters are emerging as believable, original, and sympathetic. Gere and Roberts work easily together. We sense that their characters not only like one another, but feel comfortable with one another. The catch is, neither one trusts the feeling of comfort. They've been hurt so often, they depend on a facade of cynical detachment. Everything is business. He offers her money to spend 1 week with him. She accepts. He buys her clothes, they have sex, and of course, this being the movies, they fall in love. They fall into a particularly romantic kind of love, the sort you hardly see in the movies these days. A love based on staying awake after the lights are out and confiding autobiographical secrets. This is the first Gere film containing more confession than nudity. During the day, the lovers try to recover their cold detachment to maintain the distance between them. If the love story in Pretty Woman is inspired by Cinderella, the daytime scenes are Pygmalion, as the hotel manager, Hector Elizondo, takes a liking to his best customer's niece and tutors her on which fork to use at a formal dinner. There is a subplot involving Gere's attempts to take over a corporation run by an aging millionaire, Ralph Bellamy, a man whose life work he is prepared to savage, even though he actually likes him. There are broad Freudian hints that Gere's entire career is a form of revenge against his father, and that Bellamy may be the father figure he is searching for. But he has an impulse to hurt what he loves, and there is one particularly painful scene in which Gere reveals to a friend that Roberts is a prostitute, and Roberts gains a certain insight by how hurtful that betrayal is. I mentioned that the movie is sweet and innocent. It is. It protects its fragile love story in the midst of cynicism and compromise. The performances are critical for that purpose. Garry plays new notes here. His swagger is gone, and he's more tentative, proper, even shy. Roberts does an interesting thing. She gives her character an irrepressibly bouncy sense of humor and then lets her spend the movie trying to repress it. Actresses who can do that and look great can have whatever they want in Hollywood. Garry's career is on a roll right now, after this movie, and the completely opposite, swaggeringly erotic character he plays in Internal Affairs. In Esquire magazine a few months ago, a collection of Hollywood jokes included one where the punchline was that a producer was going to be stuck with Richard Gere in his movie. After these 2 movies, the joke doesn't work anymore. The movie was directed by Garry Marshall, the Flamingo Kid, whose films betray an instinctive good nature, and it is about as warm-hearted as a movie about 2 cold realists can possibly be. I understand that earlier versions of the screenplay were more hard-boiled and downbeat, and that Marshall underlined the romance. There could indeed be, I suppose, an entirely different movie made from the same material, a more realistic film, in which the cold economic realities of the lives of both characters would make it unlikely they could stay together. And, for that matter, a final scene involving a limousine, a fire escape, and some flowers is awkward and feels tacked on. But by the end of the movie, I was happy to have it close, as it does. You should totally watch Pretty Woman. My aunt instructed me when we were recently discussing romantic films. Here's the thing. I don't do romantic films. I usually hate watching rom-coms and find them so cliched and predictable. I explained all this to my aunt, but she insisted that I would really like Pretty Woman if I gave it a chance. Well, what with it being Valentine's Day coming up soon, there seemed to be no better time than now to check the film out. I could easily watch it and write up a scathing review about how much I disliked the film. However, as I started to watch it, I slowly fell under its charm, much like how Edward Lewis, Richard Gere's character, falls under the spell of the lovable Vivian Ward, Julia Roberts. Quickly, I found myself laughing at Roberts' one-liners and witty comebacks, swooning over the way that Gere's character would gaze at Vivian, and cheering on Vivian as she stood up for herself against the snobby shop clerks. By the end of the film, I was sobbing my little heart out. By all accounts, I should hate Pretty Woman, as it represents everything I dislike in a Hollywood film. And whilst I may like aspects of the film, I still have issues with certain things, especially concerning the portrayal of sex workers in the film and the leer of the male gaze. I thought I would approach this review in a slightly different way and detail all the things I found good about the film, the things I considered to be bad, and what I consider to be ugly. So, without any further ado, let's get into my sort of review of Pretty Woman. Firstly, I want to say how much I liked the character of Vivian. Julia Roberts is so sweet and adorable in this film, and she really brings out Vivian's vulnerable side. In lesser hands, the character could have been very artificial and fake, but Roberts manages to make her come across as very authentic, even though the overall premise, narrative and dialogue, does little to make the world of Pretty Woman appear realistic. Vivian is very independent, choosing not to have a pimp, and is very streetwise. As discussed in a CNN article, Pretty Woman at 25, Vivian is described as no pushover. She dictates the way she wishes to be treated. When he offers her the status of a mistress, she dictates the status of a full equal, writes Bridget McCone in a more recent Bitch Flicks piece titled, Why Pretty Woman Should Be Considered a Feminist Classic. Let us never forget that when the prince rescues her, she rescues him right back. I agree with this view. You never get the sense that she's naive and out of her depth. She may have made several unwise decisions that have led her down the career path of becoming a sex worker, but at least she's aware that she's made these choices in her life and tries her best to own them. As Matthew Jacobs writes for the HuffPost, Pretty Woman never paints Vivian as a hapless tramp with no chance of prosperity. She's Cinderella for the dawning millennium. Julia Roberts isn't the only actor who manages to make their character appear real. Although Gere has criticized the film since its release, he did manage to make the character of Edward seem less of a jerk than how he's written. Gere has that likable charm to him, and the chemistry that exists between him and Roberts jumps off the screen. As discussed in the CNN piece, Gere and Roberts, despite their 18-year age difference, have genuine chemistry. The interplay between her goofy exuberance and his bemused stoicism is mostly effective. The film mostly works because of the capability of these two actors, and we stay invested in the story because of their interactions with one another. Lastly, another good point is how the film approaches the subject of consent. One of the most impactful scenes in the film is when Vivian argues with Edward about how he told his friend Stucky, Jason Alexander, about her profession at a polo match and accuses him of trying to pass her around to his friends. You think you can just pass me around to your friends? I'm not your toy. You don't own me. I decide. I say who. I say when. I say who. As feminist Roxane Gay puts it, consent is a real part of this movie. I think the way she acts is pretty feminist, especially for the time. For a woman to be sexy and to be self-actualized in the ways that Vivian is self-actualized is not something we saw a lot of in movies at the time. While there are several good aspects to consider regarding Pretty Woman, there are also a lot of downsides. Firstly, the film is essentially a modern fairy tale, which tries to paint the picture that the only way that Vivian will ever escape her reality is with the help of Edward. Katie Hale-Jares, a board member of the Sex Workers Outreach Project, SWAP USA, has discussed Pretty Woman and its troubling messages in great depth. As discussed in the CNN piece, Vivian's exit from sex work thanks to Gere's character is also troubling, as Gere states. In the movie, she's able to fill economic void with Edward's money, but in reality, that doesn't happen. Whilst at times the film's dialogue openly mocks the fact that the film is essentially a retelling of the classic fairy tales such as Cinderella or Rapunzel. In one scene, Vivian and her friend-colleague Kit, Laura San Giacomo, discuss whether they know of any hookers who have managed to settle down. Vivian demands Kit to give her a name, and Kit responds with the following line. "What? You want me to name someone? You want like a name? Oh God, the pressure of a name. I got it. Cinda-fucking-rella." Vivian even confides to Edward about her abusive mother and dysfunctional upbringing, explaining how she was locked up in an attic and would fantasize about being rescued by a prince. The film never attempts to discuss how fairy tales can have a negative impact on our self-esteem, especially for young girls. Fairy tale princesses are often described as being beautiful, as if this is the only characteristic worthy of mentioning. As Vanessa Loader writes for the HuffPost, if women are valued for looking pretty and for finding a prince rather than for hard work, resilience, courage, and powerful vulnerability, what is that telling our children, sons and daughters, about how women should behave and what they should focus on? The film pays a lot of attention to Vivian's beauty and her sex appeal. Edward talks about Vivian in terms of her beauty, even dropping the line, "Do you have anything in this shop as beautiful as she is?" when going shopping with her. The film also promotes the idea that money fixes all of life's problems, and the film celebrates a consumerist lifestyle, although it's worth mentioning that Pretty Woman is clearly not the only film that does this. As the CNN piece discusses, the film openly celebrates the greed is good culture that existed in the 80s and 90s. Ideologically, Pretty Woman is a love song to consumerism and capitalism, said Bitch Flicks Johnson. Pretty Woman depicts a world where everyone is either a card-carrying member of the corporate caste or an obliging subordinate. It is obsessed with things, hotel suites, private jets, fancy clothes, and encourages the audience to share its obsession with things. While many of us love a good shopping spree scene, it does feel that Vivian is only valued as a person once she wears the right labels. It is also worth mentioning that the film encapsulates the male gaze in a very obvious and obnoxious way. This is most apparent when we are introduced to Vivian, as the first thing we see of her is her bottom as she lies down in bed, her back turned to the camera. Instantly, her character is presented to us in an overly sexualized manner, and she is often treated in a demeaning manner by the male characters. The scene towards the end of the film, where she is attacked by Stuckey, is a perfect example at how sex workers are often victims of abuse by the hands of men. The ugly. I was shocked to discover that one of the film's taglines was, "Who knew it was so much fun to be a hooker?" The reality of being a sex worker is a grim and very disturbing one and shouldn't be treated as something so lighthearted. As stated in a piece for the HuffPost, 17 Facts About Sexual Violence and Sex Work. Sex workers experience high levels of sexual violence. Globally, sex workers have a 45 to 75% chance of experiencing sexual violence at some point in their careers, and a 32 to 55% chance of experiencing sexual violence in a given year. Although Vivian and Kit do occasionally discuss the tough reality of being a sex worker, they seem to be doing quite well, all things considering. They may be struggling to pay the rent, but at least they have a roof over their heads. Both women appear to be in good health, and they don't appear to have any serious, heavy drug addictions, and they often demeaning other sex workers by calling them crack whores to distinguish how they are better than them. Vivian is presented as someone who is exceptional and is worthy of being rescued because she can easily assimilate into the world of ball gowns and opera nights. As stated by Hale Jarnes in the CNN piece, what's problematic is how it portrays sex work at large, like she's the only one worth saving. You get the sense that she's not the norm, and that allows us to get invested in her while not necessarily worrying about the welfare of other women who fall into the sex worker stereotype. Conclusion. So, do I like Pretty Woman as a whole? Well, it's difficult. I wouldn't recommend this film to anyone seeking a strong representation of feminist empowerment. I certainly wouldn't want any young girls watching this film, and wouldn't show this movie to anyone under the age of 16 because of how negatively it portrays the role of women in society as a whole. It certainly is a film of its time, and it helps to reflect on how far we have come since 1990. Overall, Pretty Woman is just a bit of consumerist entertainment that is fun whilst it's on the screen, but leaves a very bad taste in your mouth afterwards. There are a lot of fantasies at play in Pretty Woman, the hit romantic comedy that transformed Julia Roberts into one of the biggest stars in Hollywood virtually overnight 30 years ago. It's a fantasy about a humble Georgia girl getting her fairy tale ending. It's a fantasy about upward mobility on the streets and salons of Beverly Hills. It's a fantasy about turning Roberts herself into a modern-day Audrey Hepburn, prime and elegant, and absolutely certain to know which type of fork is appropriate for each course. But the most unlikely fantasy of all is Roberts playing a Hollywood Boulevard streetwalker who really isn't that kind of gal. Roberts plays Vivian Ward, an 11th grade dropout who lives in a flophouse with Kit, Laura San Giacomo, her irreverent best friend and prostitution guru. The film makes it clear that she's new to sex trade, that she doesn't do drugs, not that she doesn't have a pimp, and that she enjoys complete agency over the questions of who, when, and how much. Late in the film, after Vivian has spent a week at the Beverly Wilshire with a rich client, Kit tells her, "You sure don't fit in on the boulevard looking like you do. Not that you ever did." But really, money is everything in Pretty Woman. The film may have come out in early 1990, but for anthropological purposes, it's as 1980s as Donkey Kong, Bananarama, and the Rubik's Cube. The first utterances of the script reference a savings and loan officer, and Edward picks up Vivian in a 1989 Silver Lotus Esprit that he can't drive. The most famous sequences of the film are Vivian shopping on Rodeo Drive with Edward's cash and credit card, the camera ogling brands like Louis Vuitton, Gucci, and BMW. Aside from Edward's sleazy lawyer Philip, Jason Alexander, the biggest villains here are the shopkeepers who get one look at Vivian in her Hollywood Boulevard getup and say, "I don't think we have anything for you." Vivian's rejection at this salon paves the way for a sweet comeuppance later on, when she takes her business elsewhere, but the film secretly sides with the snobs. It implies that she really isn't a good enough person to deserve high-end service, so it's up to the hotel manager, played by Marshall favorite Hector Elizondo, to give her lessons in refinement. Pretty Woman wants the audience to see Elizondo as the ultimate gentleman, and the actor is charming enough to oblige. But in actuality, it's an embarrassment to have her at his hotel. That she turns out to be a prize pupil surprises him, but he's the gatekeeper to Edward's world, and she needs to learn how to be rich. And yet, for all its risible qualities, including a third-act sexual assault attempt, star power takes it much further than it has any right to go. Roberts makes a glamorous Cinderella, but she's also blessedly unpretentious, given to little bursts of laughter and salty language even after she's been through charm school. The bit where Edward surprises Vivian by snapping a necklace case on her fingers is an all-time movie moment for a reason. Roberts looks impossibly elegant in the shoulderless red dress and white satin gloves, but she can't suppress the yelping laugh that connects her to common folk. Gary's tendency to underact, occasionally to the point to somnambulism, makes him the perfect counterpoint to the Vista Vision bigness of Roberts' charm, like a diamond that only pops when it's offset by a much simpler setting. There's every reason to resist the gross materialism and conservative sexual politics of Pretty Woman, but Roberts makes Vivian's ascendance to the upper crust a victory for the little guy. Being happy for her is as easy as being happy for a friend who hit the lottery. Another day, another first-time viewing of a classic. This time it's Pretty Woman, the film that catapulted Julia Roberts into stardom. Here, she plays Vivian, a prostitute who is hired by a businessman, Edward Lewis, Richard Gere, to accompany him for the week to social events, and they end up falling in love. In story, I think what's most interesting about Pretty Woman is how elegantly it handles the class issue, and how everyone sticks up their noses at Vivian because she's a prostitute and because of the way she dresses. It's not a film about transforming her into a pretty woman, which, let's be real, she is from the start, but increasing her confidence about herself and the way she's viewed. At least, that's how I took it, but it's also just called that because of the song. It's kind of great watching the dress montage for the first time when Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison plays. When they played the chords for it, but didn't actually play the lyrics the first time, I was grumpy for a minute until they actually went into it. As for Roberts' performance itself, it's amazing. Vivian is just someone you root for. She's so likable, playful, and down to earth, and she is just plainly herself. What you see is what you get. The way she's able to win over characters around her, like the hotel manager Barney Thompson, a wonderful Hector Elizondo, feels authentic and effortless. Roberts is so charming in this great role, and it's no wonder this made her a star and brought her a second Oscar nomination. Her chemistry with Richard Gere is also strong, and there are some steamy scenes. And since I wanted to see Vivian happy, I rooted for Edward to do the right thing. I just didn't really care about his side of the story all that much, which really becomes the core story because, truthfully, there is not that much going on in Vivian's life, but it's interesting learning about her backstory and how she went into prostitution. Anyway, Edward's a big corporate bully trying to take over a company owned by James Morse, Ralph Bellamy, which he will sell for much more money. I just cared about the romance and Vivian, and that's where the film was strong and very funny. Their chemistry grew throughout, and I did like Edward towards the end of the film. One great part about their romance is that Vivian has a rule about no kissing on the lips. So when there is kissing, all bets are off, and it becomes even more charming. I liked Edward towards the end of the film when his arc was complete, fully wanting to take down companies to growing a heart. But the character's boring throughout. I like Garry in Primal Fear, but I just didn't think he left much of an impression here. It could be the point near the beginning since he's a corporate jackass, but when I looked at his eyes, they seemed cold. There's just nothing there, like he sold his soul for the best parking spot. His girlfriend dumps over the phone near the beginning of the film, and that doesn't affect him in the slightest. I get it. He's stoic, but it's not likable. I just didn't care for the character until the end, where he seemed like a real human being. To be fair, he feels authentic when he's with Vivian, and Gere plays the boring character well, because his calm demeanor matches well with Robert's bubbly personality. I do think Roberts brings enough charm for the two of them, too. At least Edward has more bite to him as a character than his lawyer sidekick Philip Stuckey, Jason Alexander, and you just know he's bad news when he has a name like Stuckey. He's a weasel and a creep who feels like an amalgamation of everyone who treats her like a prostitute and not like a human. He's not a good person, and he's cliched to a point where he makes the dress saleswomen who shooed Vivian away near the beginning of the film look like her best friends. Most of the material in J.F. Lawton's screenplay is very solid, but Stuckey is the one thing that feels very unrealistic in how he progresses from unfunny sidekick lawyer to total scumbag. That arc comes out of left field and is only present for conflict between Vivian and Edward. Though, for Alexander, he's talented, and I'm glad he's mainly known as George Costanza and not Philip Stuckey. Thank heavens for Seinfeld. Pretty Woman is without a doubt one of the most revolutionary, iconic rom-coms in the genre. It was released in 1990 to some pretty harsh reviews and currently holds a 62% on Rotten Tomatoes, if you care about that kind of thing. Despite the criticism, some valid, some vapid, Pretty Woman went on to gross over $500 million worldwide. It also helped propel Julia Roberts onto the Hollywood A-list. I can acknowledge that for this review, I watched Pretty Woman with new, more mature eyes, as I try to do with every rom-com I loved in the 90s. Did I find aspects of it problematic? Yes, of course I did. I'm not entirely sure this movie would fly with audiences today. The hooker with a heart of gold, needing and wanting to be saved from her lowly status by the wealthy, emotionally unavailable prince. I would like to think that modern views on sex work have evolved since 1990, and no one would use the term hooker in 2019, though sadly, I'm sure plenty of people still do. But I also found that there are some aspects of Pretty Woman that felt fairly progressive. Vivian Ward, Roberts, realizes her job is not ideal, but she makes the rules. She says who, when, and where, and how much. She gets tested, she insists on condoms, she even flosses after strawberries and champagne because, gum health is super important. There are moments in this movie that still feel uncomfortably relevant. The belief that sex workers are not people, that they're essentially open and available for anyone, whether they want it or not. Pretty Woman occasionally touches on these issues, but ultimately, the darker aspects of sex work remain glossed over, probably because this is still a Garry Marshall-directed rom-com. When Edward Lewis, Richard Gere, a corporate raider on business in L.A., gets lost on his way to Beverly Hills, he is approached by a prostitute named Vivian, who is willing to give him directions to his hotel in exchange for cash. Edward agrees, and by the time they've reached Edward's hotel, the two of them have bonded enough for Edward to invite her upstairs to his room, the penthouse. After a night of champagne, revealing phobias, I Love Lucy, and of course sex, Edward propositions Vivian, spend the week with him as his employee date, and she'll walk away with $3,000, the original title of the film when it was more of a gritty, dark drama. Vivian agrees with gusto, and the journey to love begins. Through Edward, Vivian realizes her potential, and through Vivian, Edward finds his conscience. The movie is sure to remind us as to just how similar Edward and Vivian really are. We both screw people for money. Pretty Woman is formulaic and overrun with rom-com tropes, though it's possible a few of those tropes originated in this film. But it's also propelled by Julia Roberts' performance. She's the cool girl, adorably quirky and smart, despite some of her naivety in terms of social status and class. Vivian comes across as calm and confident, but her uncertainties are evident in her constant fidgeting. Roberts is energetic and charming in the role, whereas Gere is appealing but subdued as Edward. He simply seems tired of his path in life, despite having essentially everything he could possibly want. Gere and Roberts play well off of each other. Their chemistry is palpable and fuels the movie, making it easier to believe in the Cinderella fantasy. While the chemistry between the two leads is essential to any rom-com, the supporting cast is just as important to keep it from feeling bland or one-dimensional. Thankfully, the cast of Pretty Woman is just as fun to watch as Gere and Roberts. There is a subtle but wonderful performance by Hector Elizondo as Barney Thompson, the hotel manager and Vivian's fairy godmother, and Laura San Giacomo is extremely funny as Kit, Vivian's loving, wisecracking roommate and friend. Every fairy tale also needs a villain, and that's where Jason Alexander comes in, skeeving up the screen as Edward's shady lawyer, Philip Stuckey. Keep an eye out for a quick appearance by Hank Azaria as well. There is nothing realistic about Pretty Woman. It's a fairy tale through and through, and if you can overlook some of its glaring issues, it's something of an endearing romance. If nothing else, it's had an incredible impact on pop culture, from Roberts' shopping spree and subsequent takedown of some snotty saleswomen to her iconic red evening dress. The movie has been referenced, parodied, and paid homage to more times than I can count. Even 2019's wonderful rom-com, Long Shot, borrows quite a bit from the Pretty Woman experience. On March 23, 1990, Buena Vista unveiled Pretty Woman in theaters, where it went on to gross $463 million worldwide and earned Julia Roberts a Best Actress Oscar nomination at the 63rd Academy Awards. The Hollywood Reporter's original review is below. Pretty Woman tackles the lighter side of prostitution, creating a romantic comedy out of a busy executive's need for submissive female company and conjuring the perfect lifetime companion out of a woman for hire. In plot terms, this somewhat controversial premise resolves itself into a collection of smoothly written vignettes, charting the transformation of a streetwalker from vulgarian to sophisticate and thus acceptable wife material for a rich man. The movie displays an almost preternatural disregard for women's feelings. Call it Pygmalion, with a heavy accent on the first syllable. But the comedy is so slickly delivered that audiences may be content with chuckling over its polished surface charms. The film also marks the return of Richard Gere to conventional leading man status, which might add considerably to box office punch and more than mollify female audience goers. Throw in some squeaky clean peekaboo sex, the film's puzzling R rating has nothing to do with nudity, and you have the formula for a box office success. Garry stars as Edward Lewis, a super-wealthy corporate takeover artist whose hard-driving business practice has just ruined his first post-divorce romance. Lost driving around the streets of Los Angeles, he stops to ask streetwalker Vivian Ward, Julia Roberts, directions. She agrees to do so for $20, and in a bit of effectively cute business that is the film's hallmark, ends up driving the shift-fumbling Lewis's sports car. By the time they get to his Beverly Hills hotel, Lewis has decided to make Vivian his paid companion for the week, allowing him to negotiate his way through a series of business meetings that call for sociable coupling. Eventually, as he falls in love with Vivian, Lewis, all evidence to the contrary, decides money cannot buy happiness and gives up his ruthless stalking of a shipbuilding company, deciding to help the old codger, Ralph Bellamy, who owns it, run a productive firm. Once Lewis and Vivian have hooked up, the plot is locked into an undeterred straight line. Vivian has some trouble adjusting to the high life's etiquette and dress, but they are minor bumps in the road. A friendly hotel manager, Hector Elizondo, helps with forklifting, while an intimidating flourish of credit cards by Lewis break the icy reserve of snobby Rodeo Drive salespeople. In fact, director Gary Marshall and writer J.F. Lawton are at such a loss to express the difficulty of class crossing that they lift the horse racing scene from My Fair Lady and reinsert it here. If Vivian's march to social acceptability is smooth, her climb into Lewis's arms is steeper, though no less linear. Sleeping together from the start, it is not long before Lewis' insistence on a cash relationship begins to break down under Vivian's charms, a development considerably helped by the filmmaker's decision to make Vivian a naif whose sojourn on the streets has somehow not damaged the innocent little girl inside, and outside, for that matter, her. Most of Pretty Woman's activity takes place around the edges, in cleverly detailed comic encounters among the supporting characters. Vivian's shopping expeditions, particularly one featuring Larry Miller as a comically obsequious sales manager, and her friendship with an exaggeratingly wisecracking fellow hooker, Laura San Giacomo, as well as Lewis's encounters with his smarmy lawyer, expertly played by yuppie specialist Jason Alexander, end up providing more laughs, and for the latter, almost as much drama as the Vivian-Lewis relationship. Albert Brenner's gilt production design is just about the most authentic part of the film, while James Newton Howard's score gently nudges the emotional development along. Henry Sheehan, originally published on March 19, 1990. Movie stars have a way of amplifying their magnetism and completely take over a film by the ways that make them special. Everything else can fall away simply because when that movie star is operating at such a high level, any other deficiencies the film may have will not matter as much. Finding another film that has this happen more than in Pretty Woman will take some work, as Julia Roberts goes on the charm offensive and completely carries this story. Applying her trade as a sex worker on the streets of Los Angeles, Vivian, Julia Roberts, gets picked up by businessman Edward, Richard Gere, as he wants directions to his hotel. As he pays her for a night of service, he offers her compensation to spend the entire week with him, as he sets to close another deal that will destroy a family business but rake in plenty of cash for him. Often, when writing about romantic comedies, I mention the importance of the chemistry of the two leads, and how that can elevate the quality of the film beyond the material they receive. Well, in this feature, Julia Roberts does enough for the pair, given the lackluster work she had to work against. As Vivian, she enters the fray as such a spunky and lively woman, entering this world of high society, even if only for a week, and completely shines brighter than everything else in this feature. A performance that defines what power a movie star can in a production simply by utilizing her world-famous smile. On the many occasions where Vivian feels moments of joy, it creates such a feeling of elation that it brightens up the entire screen. A type of magnetism that Richard Gere's Edward did not contribute to this film. The central dynamic of the film does raise some intriguing questions about the mechanics of not how these two would spend time together physically, but rather how someone like Vivian will look to others when she enters temporarily into a new class system because of the compensation received. After all, he's not paying her just to stay in his room and wait for his return each night, but gives her money to buy new clothes as they will go out on the town together for business purposes. Therefore, Vivian now needs to present herself to those in Edward's circle. And these scenes bring some comedic moments, but also some deeply sad ones. We have those fish-out-of-water moments where she does not understand the norms of how people at that level of wealth behave, but also the scenes where the class disparity does present itself that belittles our lead character in ways this film does not have too much interest in exploring, given the genre, but still exists. This appears with the hotel manager Barney, Hector Elizondo, and the shop clerks at a clothing store that dismiss her immediately when she walks into their Rodeo Drive establishment. Romantic comedies do not have an obligation to do a deep dive in these sorts of subjects, but when it directly informs the other lead character in Edward, we should pay attention to it because it explains his world and how he thrusts Vivian right into it. This ultimately displays what makes Edward far from a captivating character. Gere sleeps his way through this performance that begs the question of what in the world does Vivian see in this guy that gets her to break her important rule of not kissing any client of hers on the lips. It becomes quite obvious this feature falls into the dreaded trap of wealth being the main point of attraction for the male lead, as they provide nothing else. Therefore, this becomes not necessarily a recognizable romance, but how much money could a man throw at a woman to make herself believe she has fallen in love with him? Now, this is not to say we should have gotten more of an in-depth look at this character, given it would take away from the real star of the show, but the other romantic lead should at least give something in rounding out what should be a pairing worth rooting for. Pretty Woman is a fantastic movie that exceeded my expectations in every way. Richard Gere and Julia Roberts exude scintillating chemistry. Whether it's their heartfelt, genuine repartee or those powerful moments of silence where no words are needed, both actors are at the top of their game in this 1990 classic. Pretty Woman was directed by Garry Marshall, and he did a superb job of capturing every moment perfectly. His transitions are smooth, as is the way the camera glides throughout the film, accentuating the actors and their environs. I Love Lucy makes an appearance in Pretty Woman, and Garry Marshall cut his teeth in the entertainment business by writing for I Love Lucy, so its inclusion was a nice tribute. James Newton Howard scored Pretty Woman, and it's some of the most magnificent music he's ever created. I thought his work on The Prince of Tides was great, which it was, but this score, which came a year prior to the Barbra Streisand and Nick Nolte gem, is astoundingly beautiful. It's both simple and lush, a masterwork that all composers should study. I just discovered that Garry Marshall, Richard Gere, and Julia Roberts reunited for another romantic film in 1999, Runaway Bride. That movie features many of the supporting actors from Pretty Woman too. Clearly, this is next up on my to-watch list. Pretty Woman is a brilliant love story that swept me away. It's a modern-day, at least in 1990, spin on Cinderella, a glorious exploration of two people falling in love who at first seem radically different, only to discover that they are irrefutably alike. Pretty Woman is timeless, and I can't wait to see its musical adaptation. Edward, a rich entrepreneur, hires Vivian, a prostitute, to accompany him to a few social events. Trouble ensues when he falls in love with her, and they try to bridge the gap between their worlds. This is basically a Cinderella story, with Pygmalion sprinkled in from time to time. That mixture worked for me as the two fit each other so well. The movie is, thus, far from original, but the execution matters, and here it transcended the material effortlessly. Movies aren't made like this anymore. This is the usual saying these days, and I don't quite like to use it, but here its usage is quite apt, unfortunately. In the time of cynics, this movie would never be made. But back in 1990, not only was it popular, but it was the third highest grossing picture of the year. And it's easy to see why so many people loved it, as it's immensely enjoyable to this day. While none of it is believable in the slightest, and the ending is obviously terribly cliched in its rom-com trappings, I mostly still managed to suspend my disbelief and enjoyed the movie for what it is, which is a wonderfully acted and endearing romantic comedy. The performances drive this movie to much greater heights. Richard Gere and Julia Roberts have rarely been better than they were here in probably their most iconic roles. Gere is very charming, likable, and perfectly cast as this gentleman with a lot of money, but also a lot of sweetness to him. His calm voice was soothing here. But Roberts steals the show, obviously. This is a fantastic, truly revelatory turn by an actress who would become a true star right after this movie's release. She is very believable in the role. She was never sexier than she was here, and her smile and hair are perfection. The two share great chemistry together, and her character is so much fun. Pretty Woman benefits from pretty solid humor and a very strong romantic atmosphere throughout. The movie's comedic situations are well executed and never overstepping their bounds by going into overly slapstick territory. The second half is much less interesting, as it has some manufactured drama between the protagonist and one of his friends, and the ending is annoying. But other than that, the flick is a blast to watch. Garry Marshall's Pretty Woman is easily one of the most successful movies in the romance genre to date. It is number 4 in the box office for romantic comedies and has grossed close to $200 million in its lifetime. The casting of Pretty Woman is perhaps one of its most successful elements. Richard Gere, who was considered the sex symbol of the country at the time, fits his role perfectly. A rich, sexy, successful businessman who doesn't drink, do drugs, or smoke seems to many women like the perfect guy. Julia Roberts, who was relatively unknown at the time, besides her appearance in Steel Magnolias, was not the first choice for the part, however. Her appearance in Pretty Woman seemed to be the breakthrough for her career. The acting throughout the film was very genuine, as some of its most memorable scenes were not scripted. About three-quarters of the way through the film, when Edward presents Vivian with a very expensive necklace to wear, she reaches for it, only for Edward to snap the lid of the jewelry case on her hand. This caused her to laugh hysterically, a very genuine moment between the two lead actors. I personally loved this movie. The director was able to take a serious issue such as prostitution and show how a person can change over time and evolve. Even though Julia Roberts' character began working as a prostitute, her humor and free spirit made her relatable to the audience. It takes a talented director and a talented actress to pull something like that off. Everett Collection. 20 years ago this week, I wrote a review in EW of a new Hollywood romantic comedy. Back then, they didn't come out of the cookie cutter with quite such frequency. It was called Pretty Woman, and it starred Richard Gere as a wealthy but lonely corporate dude, the sort of natty, self-involved, empty-on-the-inside player who'd risen up in the go-go culture of the 80s, and a relative newcomer with a 500-watt smile named Julia Roberts as the prostitute he hires to spend a week with him, not so much for sex as for company. Her character, named Vivian, was entirely sweet, inside and out, even if she did dress in slinky vinyl boots that went all the way up to her neck. Unlike some people, I never had a major moral problem with the movie's premise. I didn't throw a righteous conniption fit because I thought it was sugarcoating the exploitative realities of prostitution or presenting Robert's Vivian as some sort of literal professional role model. On its own terms, however, I did think that Pretty Woman was a plastic screwball soap opera, and I complained, a bit starchily, that these are the kinds of characters who exist nowhere but in the minds of callowly manipulative Hollywood screenwriters. To which a fan of the movie might respond, and your problem with that is? To me, the two stars displayed an obligatory, rather wan and stilted non-chemistry. What's more, I'm now embarrassed to say, I was so busy picking the film apart that I missed Julia Roberts' natural girl radiance. As a result, I panned Pretty Woman fairly mercilessly and gave it a grade of D. From almost the moment that my review of Pretty Woman appeared, it became the most infamous review I had ever written or probably ever would write. At the risk of sounding grandiose, and seriously, has that ever stopped me before? It became part of my brand, my legend, my writerly DNA. I was no longer just any old movie critic. I was the guy who gave Pretty Woman a D, and I always would be. I've never felt that my review of Pretty Woman was a very good piece. Its tone is miffed, hectoring, and righteously unamused. I should have lightened up a bit and had more fun dissing the movie, even if I didn't care for it. And a bit of the notoriety of my review, I have to say, may have had something to do with the newness of the magazine. At that point, it was issue number 6. Entertainment Weekly was still a very young publication struggling to find its tone and its footing. Because Pretty Woman was the first movie I reviewed here that became a cultural touchstone virtually overnight, the review made me look, in certain people's eyes, like I was out of touch with mainstream values. My God, he doesn't like the big hits. My editor-in-chief for the next 12 years, James Seymour, always staunchly protected my right to say whatever I wanted in a review. But on a personal level, he never stopped tweaking me for panning Pretty Woman. He'll be pleased to know that I no longer agree with my review. I watched Pretty Woman again in the late 90s when I was warming up to review Runaway Bride, which re-teamed the movie's 2 stars, and what I saw on that second viewing is that I was wrong about Roberts and Gere. They did have chemistry. It was there in the quiet amusement of his reactions, his inner delight at her outward vulgarity, and in her need to melt through his reserve. And plugging into that teasing, almost private camaraderie, I saw the movie's cheeseball charm. I also saw its shrewdness as a kind of primal princess makeover fantasy. The thing is, that's exactly what had pissed me off about it the first time. Looking back on my fatal first reaction to Pretty Woman, I think the D grade I gave it was so low that it didn't necessarily match the review I wrote. That grade was like a scarlet letter. Frankly, it came off as a slap, and I truly regret it. The reason that I wanted to slap the movie, however, is that I did have a moralistic problem with it. I was up on my high horse, all right. What made me overreact so badly, what caused me to experience Pretty Woman through a lens of huffiness, is that every moment I was watching it, I was actually fighting and rejecting the movie's message. Not the part about a hooker with a heart of gold, but the part about a Cinderella in vinyl boots who learns to stop worrying and love the makeover. Image credit, Everett Collection. In the one line of my review that I still stand by, I predicted, the movie may catch on. With its tough hooker heroine, it can work as a feminist version of an upscale princess fantasy. That, in fact, is exactly how it worked. In the last 20 years, there have been far better romantic comedies than Pretty Woman. But the reason, I think, that the movie occupies such a singular place in the hearts of so many women is that it marked an essential swing of the pendulum back toward a new style version of old-fashioned girly girl values. The movie said, you can be a feminist and a seductress, a hooker and a princess, all at the same time, and you can dress up and look like $1,000,000 while doing it. That message helped to usher in a new age of fashion obsession, an era in which the romantic and the cosmetic would be entangled with a newly seductive, if not addictive, intensity. It marked Pretty Woman as the rare Hollywood movie that doesn't just channel the culture, but changes it. In the myopia of my righteousness, I did grasp that it was a movie about buying things. Wow, major insight, that's the film's basic concept. But I got a bit too peeved about it. The moment in the picture I really hated, I think it colored the tone of my whole piece, is the famous and much beloved scene in which Vivian goes back to the clothing boutique and says, in essence, "How do you like me now, bitch?" Here's how I described it in the final paragraph of my review. At one point, Roberts wanders into a Rodeo Drive boutique, still clad in her hooker garb. The store ladies gaze in shock and refuse to help her, as though here, in the hedonistic center of Beverly Hills, they'd never encountered a flagrantly exposed midriff before. To get revenge, Roberts returns to the store a few scenes later, only this time, she's wearing a more restrained sundress, and she proudly announces that she's going to do her buying elsewhere. In today's Hollywood, this passes for integrity. That last line is pretty awful. I sound like Peter Travers in another Paper Tiger installment of his Damn You Hollywood series. What I wish I'd said, if only to make the point better, is that Vivian should have gone back to the store armed with a new self-esteem, but that what the film arms her with is the power of a credit card. I wish I'd said that Pretty Woman, in the boutique scene, at least, is a movie that wants to sneer at designer-class snobbery and eat it too. In that way, I do think I was on to something about Pretty Woman. In just about every other way, I think I was wrong. I would now, incidentally, give the movie a grade of B. For just a moment, however, I want to touch on a larger question that's raised by the teensy, trivial scandal of my review, a question that has never been more relevant than it is today. Namely, why does a review that people disagree with almost always provoke such bitter, fulminating, toxic intolerance? When did our culture of bloggy, shoot-from-the-hip opinion turn into such a culture of haters? I'm one of the many who think that Pauline Kael is the single greatest film critic who ever lived, the most brilliant and exciting and perceptive, and far and away the most extraordinary as a writer. Yet for all the bravura, commonsensical passion of her insights, I disagreed with Kael all the time, and she occasionally had opinions that I thought were nuts. She hated All the President's Men, preferred Ghostbusters 2 to the original, insisted that some of Brian De Palma's worst movies, like Casualties of War, were masterpieces, believed that Woody Allen was on the wrong track when he made Annie Hall in Manhattan, and adored Mel Brooks' History of the World, PT-1. She didn't much care for Alfred Hitchcock, for God's sake. I knew Kael personally, and one of the last times I saw her, just before she retired in 1991, she had been to a screening of The Silence of the Lambs and told me how ambivalent she was about it, saying that she thought it was going to be the Psycho of the 90s. In her book, that was an insult. The point is that Pauline Kael, a brilliant and fearless writer, had the right to every last one of her opinions, even her most head-scratchingly idiosyncratic ones. It's part of what gave her criticism such flavor. Of course, she had the right to those opinions not only because she was a great critic, but because she was, quite simply, an individual, like you or me, one who said what she truthfully thought. In the 20 years since Pretty Woman, I've written plenty of other reviews that have gotten people riled, and I have no doubt that I will again. The fans of Let the Right One In still want my blood. Sorry, you can't have it. Believe it or not, the fact that I'm the only critic on RottenTomatoes.com who gave a fresh rating to Epic Movie still has some people in a snit. I say, deal with it. It's only a movie review. I haven't changed my opinions about those films, but even if you violently disagree with me, the point I want to make is that a critic doesn't have to be right all the time. He has the sacred, holy right to be wrong. So 20 years later, what do you think of Pretty Woman? Does it hold up, or does anyone think I was right the first time? And do you believe that a critic has the right to be wrong? What's the movie review, by me or anyone else, that you've disagreed with the most? Roberts have a subtle chemistry, a complicity that you want to share, and really who can steel themselves against the D-like charm of Hector Elizondo? If this movie were made in 2018, Vivian wouldn't need or want a man to save her. Maybe the story would be written or directed by a woman and focus on Kit Doka, the girl who got left behind when her friend ascended to the ranks of the 1%. But hey, Hollywood loves a sequel, so Kit, I'm rooting for you. Pretty Woman 2. Cinderella has a nice ring to it. Pretty Woman is available for rental on iTunes and Amazon Prime. This movie, directed by Gary Marshall, written by J.F. Lennon, produced by Arnon, Milchan, Stephen Reuther, Garry W. Goldstein, starring Julia Roberts, Richard Gere, Ralph Bellamy, Jason Alexander, Hector Elizondo, Laura Inamo, Alex Hyde. White cinematography, Charles Minsky, edited by Roger Nell, Priscilla Nett. Music by James Newton Howard. Production companies, Touchstone Pictures, Silver. Screen partners I4 Regency International Pictures, distributed by BAV Vista. Pictures distribution, release date March 23, 1990. Running time 119 minutes. Country, United States. Language, English. Budget $14 million. Box office 463. Woman is a 1990 American romantic comedy film directed by Gary Marshall from a screenplay by J.F. Lawton. The film stars Richard Gere and Julia Roberts and features Hector Elizondo, Ralph Bellamy and his final performance, Loris and Giacomo and Jason Alexander in supporting roles. The film's story centers on Hollywood prostitute Vivian Ward and wealthy businessman Edward Lewis. Vivian is hired to be Edward's escort for several business and social functions, and their relationship develops during her week-long stay with him. The film's title, Pretty Woman, is based on the 1964 songo Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison. The original screenplay was titled 3000 and was written by then-struggling screenwriter J.F. Lott. It is the first film on-screen collaboration between Gere and Roberts. Their second film, Runaway Bride, and also the second film on-screen collaboration between Gere and Elizondo after American Gigolo, with the next one is Runaway Bride, originally intended to be a dark cautionary tale about class and prostitution in Los Angeles. The film was reconceived as a romantic comedy. With a large budget, the film received generally positive reviews, and Roberts received a Golden Globe Award for Best Actress in a Motion Picture, Musical, or Comedy, and a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance, which catapulted her to superstardom. In addition, screenwriter J.F. Lawton was nominated for a Writer Guild Award and a BAFTA Award. The film saw the highest number of ticket sales in the U.S. ever for a romantic comedy with Box Office Mojo listing. It is the #1 romantic comedy by the highest estimated domestic tickets sold at 42.1, 76,500, slightly ahead of My Big Fat Greek Wedding at 41.4, 19,500 ticket. The film grossed us $63.3339 worldwide, behind only Ed the Extraterrestrial, $619 million at the time, Star Wars, $530 million at the time, and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, $474 million at the time. Movie plot. Edward Lewis, a powerful corporate raider hailing from New York, acquires and dismantles struggling companies selling their assets for profit. He invites his girlfriend Jessica to join him on a business trip, but she grows weary of being at his constant beck and call and decides to end their relationship one night while leaving a business party in the Hollywood Hills. Edward takes his lawyer's Lotus, a Sprit sports car, and unintentionally finds himself in the city's red light district on Hollywood Boulevard. It is here where he meets Vivian Ward, a prostitute struggling to operate the manual transmission car. Edward pays Vivian to drive him to the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Impulsively, Edward hires Vivian for the night, despite initial awkwardness, finds her charming, and ultimately has sex with her. The following day, Edward asks Vivian to pose as his girlfriend during a week-long series of business events. He must attend while attempting a takeover of James Morse's shipbuilding company. Edward offers Vivian $3,000 and a shopping spree for a new wardrobe. Excitedly, Vivian accepts the offer. However, when she tries to shop on Rodeo Drive, she is turned away by snobbish and rude saleswoman. She turns to Barney, the hotel's manager, for assistance. He teaches her proper etiquette and helps her purchase a cocktail dress for an important business dinner that evening. With the help of an upscale store sales lady, Bridget, who is very, very kind to Vivian afterwards and running late, Edward is astounded by Vivian's new look. She is wearing a stylish black cocktail dress, her red hair in a she-cup dough, and her makeup lovely during the dinner. Edward introduces Vivian to James and his grandson David. The latter is being groomed to take over the company after his grandfather passes away. The business meeting does not go well, and James and David are unimpressed by Edward's intentions to purchase and sell their company. Edward takes notice of Vivian's transformation and becomes more open with her. He rallies details about his personal and business life, including his estranged relationship with his late father Carter at the time of his death, when Edward's attorney Philip suspects that Vivian is a corporate spy after seeing her talking to David at a polo game. Edward reveals the true nature of their relationship. However, Philip later crudely propositions Vivian for her services after Edward is finished with her. Vivian feels hurt and angry that Edward exposed her in that way. Edward apologizes, admitting that he was jealous of Vivian talking to David and acknowledging that her straightforward personality is having a positive effect on him. Edward takes Vivian by private jet to catch Travada at the San Francisco Opera, a story about a prostitute who falls in love with a wealthy man. The story moves Vivian, and she breaks her no-kissing rule before having sex with Edward after believing Edward has fallen asleep. Vivian confesses her love for him as Edward's return to New York draws near. He offers to help Vivian get off the streets by suggesting that he put her up in a nice condo and provide her with an allowance. He promises to visit her regularly. However, Vivian is offended by the offer, feeling that Edward is still treating her like a prostitute. She recalls a childhood fantasy of being rescued from her abusive home by a knight on a white stay. Edward meets with James, but having been changed by his experience with Vivian, he chooses to work with him to save his company instead of dismantling it. Meanwhile, Philip is furious that Edward's new direction has cost him a fortune, so he goes to the hotel to confront him. However, he only finds Vivian there, blaming her for Edward's changing character, and angry at his business decision, he attempts to rape her. When Edward arrives, he punches Philly and fires him for his behavior after completing his business in Los Angeles. Edward asks Vivian to stay with him for one more night. However, he makes it clear that she should only do so if she wants to, not because he is paying her. Vivian gently refuses and leaves. This rejection prompts Edward to reevaluate his life, and while being driven to the airport, he asks the chauffeur to deter to Vivian's apartment building. He climbs out of the white limousine sunroof and ascends the fire escape to rescue Vivian, just like the knight in her childhood fantasy cast as per the opening credits. Richard Gyrus, Edward Lewis, a rich corporate raider from New York who hires Vivian to be his escort for a week. Julia Roberts as Vivian Ward, a free-spirited Hollywood prostitute. Ralph Bellamy as James Morris, owner of Morse Industries, a troubled shipbuilding company. Edward plans to take over Jason Alexander as Philip. Stucky Edward's insensitive lawyer Hector Elizondo is Barnard Barney Thompson, the dignified and soft-hearted friend and roommate who taught her the prostitution trade. Alex Hyde White as David Morse, James Morse's grandson, who is being groomed to take over the Morse's shipbuilding company. Amy ASPC is Elizabeth Stucky, Philip's wife. The Lard Donahue is Bridget, a friend of Barney Thompson who works in a women's clothing store. John David Carson is Mark Roth, a businessman in Edward's office. Judith Baldwin is Susan, one of Edward's ex-girlfriends, whom he runs into at Phil's party at the beginning of the film. She is recently married, and Edward's secretary was a bridesmaid. Patrick Richwood is night elevator operator. Dennis James Patrick Stewart is Dennis the Day Bellhop, Day Young, as a snobbish saleswoman in a clothing store. Larry Miller is Mr. Hollister, the manager of a clothing store where Vivian buys her new wardrobe, Honka area, as a detective development. The film was initially conceived as a dark drama about prostitution in Los Angeles in the 1980s. The relationship between Vivian and Edward also originally involved controversial themes, including Vivian being addicted to drugs. Part of the deal was that she had to stay off cocaine for a week. Edward eventually throws her out of his car and drives off. The original script by J.F. Elton, called 3000, ended with Vivian and her prostitute friend on the bus to dialing producer Laura Zisson considered these elements detrimental to a sympathetic portrayal of Vivian, and they were removed or assigned to Kit. The deleted scenes have been found, and some were included on the DVD released for the film's 15th anniversary. In one, Vivian tells Edward first, "Could just pop you, good, and be on my way," indicating her lack of interest in pillow talk. In another, she is confronted by a drug dealer Carlos, then rescued by Edward when the limo driver Daryl gets his gun out. Though inspired by such films as Wall Street in the Last Detail, the film bears a resemblance to Pollyan myths, particularly George Bernard Shaw's play of the same name, which also formed the basis for the Broadway musical My Fair Lady. It was Walt Disney Studios then. President Jeffrey Kenberg, who insisted the film be rewritten as a modern-day fairy tale and love story, as opposed to the original dark drama. It was pitched to Touchstone Pictures and rewritten as a romantic comedy. The title 3000 was changed because Disney executives thought it sounded like a title for a science fiction film. The casting of the film was a rather lengthy process. Marshall had initially considered Christopher Reeve, Daniel D. Lewis, Kevin, Denzel Washington for the role of Edward, and Albert Brooks, Sylvester Stallone, Al Pacino, and Burt Reynolds turned it down. Pacino went as far as doing a casting reading with Roberts before rejecting the part. Sam, Neil Tom K.Y., and Charles Grodin tested for the part, along with Roberts. Gere initially refused, but when he met with Roberts, she persuaded him, and he eventually agreed to play Lewis. He reportedly started off much more active in his role, but Garry Marshall took him aside and said, No, Richard, in this movie, one of you moves and one of you does not guess which one you are." Julia Roberts was not the first choice for the role of Vivian and was not wanted by Disney. Many other actresses were considered. Marshall originally envisioned Karen Allen for the role. When she declined auditions, went to many better-known actresses of the time, including Molly Ringwald, who turned it down. Manana Ryder auditioned, but was turned down because Marshall felt she was too young. Jennifer Connelly was also dismissed for the same reason. Emily Lloyd turned it down, as it conflicted with her shooting for the film Mermaids. Drew Barrymore, Patricia Arquette, Brooke Shields, Uma Thurman, and Kristen Davis auditioned for the role of Vivian. Meg Ryan, who was a top choice of Marshall's, turned it down as well. According to a note written by Marshall, Mary Steam Virgin was also among the first choices. Diane Lane came very close to being cast. They had gone as far as costume fittings, but due to scheduling conflict, she could not accept. Michelle Phayer turned the rule down, saying she did not like the lull. Script's tone. Daryl Hannah was also considered, but believed the role was degrading to women. Valeria Golino was in consideration, but was not selected because of her thick Italian accent, and Jennifer Jason Leigh had auditioned. Lee Thompson unsuccessfully auditioned for the role, as she thought the film was a drama, when all the other actresses turned down the role. 21-year-old Julia Roberts, a relative unknown with only the sleeper hit Mystic Pizza and the yet-to-be-released Steel Magnolia, for which she would be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, won the role of Vivian. Her performance made her a star. J.F. Lawton, writer of the original screenplay, has suggested that the film was ultimately given a happy ending because of the chemistry of Gere and Roberts. Veteran actor Ralph Bellamy, who plays James Morse, appears in his final acting performance before his death in 1991. Jason Alexander, who had also recently been cast for his role as the bumbling George Costanza in Seinfeld, was cast as Philip Stuckey. A VHS copy of Pretty Woman would appear in Seinfeld's apartment in later seasons of Seinfeld, as a homage to Alexander's participation in the film. Filming the film's budget was substantial at $14 million, so producers could shoot in many locations. Most filming took place in Los Angeles, California, specifically in Beverly Hills, and inside sound stages at Walt Disney Studios in Burbank. The Escargot restaurant, the Volar, was shot at the restaurant Rex, now called Cicada Scenes, set in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel lobby, were shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Filming commenced on July 24, 1989, but was immediately plagued by problems. These included Ferrari and Porsche declining the product placement. Opportunity for the car Edward drove, neither firm wishing to be associated with prostitutes. Lotus Car saw the placement value and supplied a silver 1989 plus a second-to-sprit seat. The shooting was a generally pleasant, easygoing experience, as the budget was broad and the shooting schedule was not tight. While shooting the scene where Vivian is lying down on the floor of Edward's penthouse, watching our runs of I Love Lucy, Gary Marshall had to tickle Robert's feet to get her to laugh. The scene in which Gere playfully snaps the lid of a jewelry case on her fingers was improvised, and her surprised laugh was genuine. The red dress Vivian wears to the opera has been listed among the most unforgettable dresses of all time. During the scene in which Robert sang a Proust song in the bathtub, slid down and submerged her head under the bubbles, she emerged to find the crew had left, except for the cameraman who captured the moment on film. In the love scene, she was so stressed that a vein became noticeable on her forehead and had to be massaged by Marshall and Gere. She also developed a case of hives and calamine lotion. Was filming resumed. The filming was completed on November 30th. Shelley Michelle acted as body double for Roberts in risky scenes in the film's publicity post box office in its opening weekend. The film was at number 1 at the U.S. box office, grossing $11,280, $591, and averaging $853 per theater, despite dropping to number 2 in its second weekend. It grossed more with $12,471, $670. It returned to number 1 at the U.S. box office in its sixth weekend and was number 1 for 3 weeks. It was in the top 10 movies in the U.S. for 16 weeks. In Australia, it was number 1 for 12 weeks and was number 1 for 9 consecutive weeks in the UK. As of September 29, 2009, it has grossed $178.50, $6268 in the United States, and $285 million in other countries, for a total worldwide gross of $463,000, $6,268. It was the 4th highest grossing film of the year in the United States and Canada, and the 3rd highest grossing worldwide. The film was Disney's highest grossing film ever, surpassing Three Men and a Baby, and remains Disney's highest grossing R-rated release. Critical response on review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes. The film holds an approval rating of 64%, based on 76 reviews, with an average rating of 6.0. Divided 10. The website's critical consensus states Pretty Woman may be a yuppie fantasy, but the film's slick comedy, soundtrack, and casting can overcome misgivings on Metacritic. The film has a weighted average score of 51 out of 100, based on 18 critics indicating mixed or average reviews. Audiences pulled by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of on and a plus to F scale. Owen Glaberman of Entertainment Weekly gave the film a D, saying it starts out as a Pygmalion comedy, and with its tough hooker heroine, it can work as a feminist version of an upscale princess fantasy. Gaberman also said it pretends to be about how love transcends money, but is really obsessed with status symbols on its 20th anniversary. Gaberman wrote another article saying that while he felt he was right, he would given it a B. Today, Karina Chano of the New York Times said the movie wasn't a love story, it was a money story. Its logic depended on a disconnect between character and narrative, between image and meaning, between money and value, and that made it not cluelessly traditional, but thoroughly postmodern music. The soundtrack has been certified triple platinum by the Recording Industry Association of America. The opera featured in the film is El Travat, which also served as inspiration for its plot. The highly dramatic aria fragment that is repeated as the end of Dammi 24 Forza. From the opera, Robert sings the song Kiss by Prince while she is in the tub and Gere's character is on the phone. Background music is composed by James Newton Howard. The piano piece Gere's character plays in the hotel lobby was composed and performed by Gere, entitled He Sleeps Love Theme. This piano composition is inspired by Bruce Springsteen's Racing in the Street musical adaptation. A stage musical adaptation of the film opened on Broadway on July 20th, 2018 in previews officially on August 16th at the Netherlander Theater. This follows an out-of-town tryout at the Oriental Theater in Chicago, which ran from March 13th to April 15th, 2018. The musical has music and lyrics by Bryan Adams and Jim Valance. The late Gary Marshall and J.F. Lawton wrote the book, and Jerry Mitchell is the director and choreographer. The Chicago and Broadway cast featured Samantha Barks and her Broadway debut as Vivian and Steve Kazee as Edward Barks. Finished her run as Vivian on July 21, 2019, and was replaced by Jillian Mueller. The following evening with Brennan, Hunt of Rent fame, assuming the role of Edward. Oref portrayed Kit, and Jason Danley played Philip Stuckey. Eric Anderson portrayed the role of Mr. Thompson, and Kingsley Leggs played the role of James Morse. Pretty Woman movie review. Because Pretty Woman stars Richard Gere, Hollywood's most successful male sex symbol, and because it's about his character falling in love with a prostitute, it is astonishing that Pretty Woman is such an innocent movie that it's the sweetest and most open-hearted love fable since The Princess Bride here. Is a movie that could have marched us down main streets into the sinks of iniquity, and it glows with romance. Oh, it seems to be constructed out of the stuff of realism. All right, it stars Gere as an out-of-town millionaire visiting Los Angeles who borrows his friend's car and gets lost on Hollywood Boulevard. He asks a hooker for directions to his hotel. She offers to tell him for $5 for $10 she'll guide him there. He agrees it is important to understand that he is looking for directions, not sex, and that he has broken up coldly and efficiently with his current girlfriend only half an hour earlier in a telephone conversation. The girl gets into the car, and it turns out that she knows a lot about cars. This intrigues him, and the result is that he invites her to join him in his hotel suite. But not for sex, of course, he says. But you still have to pay, of course. She says she is played by Julia Roberts, Mystic Pizza, and an Oscar-nominated role in Steel Magnolias as a woman who is as smart as she is. Attractive, which makes her very smart. Like many prostitutes, she's able to perform the mental trick of standing outside of what she does, of detaching herself in believing that her real self is not involved. That's what she does. She overhears one of his telephone conversations and wants to know what he does. He's a takeover artist. He buys companies, takes them apart, and sells the pieces for more than he paid for the whole. But what about the people who work for those companies? She wants to know. People have nothing to do with it. He explains it's strictly business. Oh, she says, then you do the same thing I do. What is happening in these scenes is that the characters are emerging as believable, original, and sympathetic. Gere and Roberts work easily together. We sense that their characters not only like one another, but feel comfortable with one another. The catch is, neither one trusts the feeling of comfort. They've been hurt so often, they depend on a facade of cynical detachment. Everything is business. He offers her money to spend 1 week with him. She accepts. He buys her clothes. They have sex, and of course they fall in love. They fall into a particularly romantic kind of love, the sort you hardly see in the movies these days. A love based on staying awake after the lights are out and confiding autobiographical secrets. This is the first-year film containing more confession than nudity. During the day, the lovers try to recover their cold detachment to maintain the distance between them. If the love story and Pretty Woman is inspired by Cinderella, the daytime scenes are Pygmalion as the hotel manager takes a liking to his best customer's niece and tutors her on which fork to use at a formal dinner. There is a subplot involving Gere's attempts to take over a corporation run by an aging millionaire, a man whose life work he is, Domio 144, prepared to savage, even though he actually likes him. There are broad Freud and hints that Gere's entire career is a form of revenge against his father, and that Bellamy may be the father figure he is searching for. But he has an impulse to hurt what he loves, and there is one particularly painful scene in which Gere reveals to a friend that Roberts is a prostitute, and Roberts gains a certain insight by how hurtful that betrayal. I mentioned that the movie is sweet, and innocent it is. It protects its fragile love story in the midst of cynicism and compromise. The performances are critical. For that purpose, Gere plays new notes. Here, his swagger is gone, and he's more additive proper. Even Shy Roberts does an interesting thing. She gives her character an irrepressibly bouncy sense of humor, and then lets her spend the movie trying to repress it. Actresses who can do that and look great can have whatever they want in Hollywood. Gere's career is on a roll right now after this movie, and the completely opposite, swaggeringly erotic character he plays in Internal Affairs in Esquire magazine. A few months ago, a collection of Hollywood jokes included one where the punchline was that a producer was going to be stuck with Richard Gere in his movie. After these two movies, the J joke doesn't work anymore. The movie was directed by Garry Marshall, whose films betray an instinctive good nature, and it is about as warm-hearted as a movie about two cold realists can possibly be. I understand that earlier versions of the screenplay were more hard-boiled and downbeat, and that Marshall underlined the romance. There could indeed be, I suppose, an entirely different movie made from the same material, a more realistic film in which the cold economic realities of the lives of both characters would make it unlikely they could stay together. And for that matter, a final scene involving a limousine. A fire escape in some flowers is awkward and feels tacked on, but by the end of the movie, I was happy to have it close, as it does other information about this movie in honor of Pretty Woman's 30th anniversary. Revisit what critics originally thought of it and why they were wrong to understand how Hollywood views women look no further than Pretty Woman, a rags to riches story about a sex worker whose blurring of the lines between her profession and her personal life fundamentally shaped our understanding of the elements that make up a successful Roman Riddick comedy. Perhaps because of the transactional nature, sex, and by extension, the woman giving it out for cash of the Pretty Woman relationship. Many of those elements involve money, the shopping scene, the makeover, the big meaningful gesture. And then there's the more gendered aspects, the reveal of the woman's true self, symbolized by Vivian's reddish curly mane, untamed and raw. There's the first kiss, even more significant here, because as a sex worker, it goes against Vivian's rules for dealing with Johns. The trope of a fallen woman who is rescued by her Prince Max, of an archaic version of male-female relationships, which partially explains the decline of the genre in recent years, until very recently when new voices and perspectives have given the rom-com a makeover of its own. But while Pretty Woman now holds rom-com and Murs status, the film 30 years later deserves a second look as a legitimate work of cinema with serious concerns about women, men, sex, class, and power, among other things. Indeed, it was controversial when it hit theaters in 1990 and the subject of some vicious takedowns in Entertainment Plus. Weekly's Owen Glaberman panned the film with a D, focusing so much on Julia Roberts' physical appearance that he completely misses her star appeal. And then there's this doozy from Richard Corus over at Time comparing Richard Gere and Roberts' characters to a toxic waste dumper and a terrorist hijacker. Many of the male-dominated reviews focus on the film's frivolity, a criticism regularly applied to rom-coms viewed as a genre that appeals to women and therefore less serious than, say, a wartime drama that said women also took issue with the film, mostly for its male gaze and its vanilla, most palatable handling of prostitution. The hooker with the heart of gold. Janet Maslin, writing for the New York Times, criticized the film's covetousness and underlying misogyny, while praising the newcomer Julia Roberts' performance as a complete knockout, revisiting the film on its 10th anniversary in 2000. Marian Johansson questioned its continued appeal among women, stating that the relentlessly cheerful depiction of prostitution is revolting. Still, the film resonated with audiences. It grossed almost $500 million worldwide, becoming a huge blockbuster that propelled Robertson to stardom and earned her an Oscar nomination. The rise of Pretty Woman is also the rise of a new female Hollywood icon. This is her movie, and as a result, it can be ours too. Julia Roberts' performance is the magic spell that makes Pretty Woman work, written by male screenwriter J.F. Lott. The film was famously originally titled 3000, a reference to the money exchanged between the two protagonists. It was a much darker version of the story, and one which might have been more interesting had it not been for Roberts' delightful star-making turn, which makes the more lighthearted premise feel snappy and palatable from the very first shot of her as Vivian Ward, filling in her worn stilettos with a black Sharpie before pulling on her vinyl thigh highs and shimmying down the fire escape. She's magnetic. It's partly due to her smile, that big-mouthed, big-toothed all-American grin that brightens up every scene. When she laughs with that loud cackle of someone who's in on every joke, you want to laugh with her. You want to be friends with Vivan man or woman, gay or straight, we all a little seduced. It is impossible not to root for her. Edward Lewis is a corporate raider who buys and sells companies with as little regard for the fate of their employees as he has for the women in his life. One night, having borrowed his sleazy lawyer's equally sleazy sports car, he gets lost and ends up smack in the middle of Hollywood, Boulevard's red light district, where Vivian and her friend, Kit Duca, are setting up for the night. A simple request for directions somehow morphs into an arrangement. Richard will pay Vivian $3,000 for a whole week of her services. And while this initially seems like the ideal short-term solution for his commitment issues and her cash flow, their relationship morphs into something neither Richard nor Vivian can really control. The story of a rich guy who's lost the meaning in his life and finds it in the arms of a gorgeous poor down-toe lady with pluck is as old as Hollywood itself. This is the industry that gave us a movie called Rich Man, Poor Girl, a 1938 comedy starring Ruth Hussey and Robert Young, How She Landed a Millionaire. The tagline read from love story to working girl to Ma in Manhattan. It's a tale that's almost synonymous with the RO romantic comedy genre. Pretty Woman itself, if based on the Pygmalion dynamic so famously captured in 964 Seconds, My Fair Lady. What makes Pretty Woman different from all the other films named above is that the woman in question is a sex worker, someone whose proverbial love is technically available to the highest bidder. She's clean and responsible. Yes, a heavy-handed point made. When she pulls a stash of multicolored condoms out of her boot, she flosses her teeth after every meal. But she's not an ingenic or a virgin seduced by expensive gifts under the goo of generosity and feeling all. Anastasia Steele in 50 Shades of Grey, the transactional aspect of such an imbalanced relationship is out in the open. In that sense, Pretty Woman is actually revolutionary and more closely fits into the way sex work is thought about now among certain feminists. As long as the consent is there, why should Vivian feel ashamed? Rom-coms have always been about an exchange of goods. So why not of the cash up front? Talking about Pretty Woman in 2018 means talking about the evolution of the attitudes around sex work. A lot has changed in the 28 years since its release. The decriminalization of sex work has been claimed as a feminist issue by many, with the view that it's just another job. Her famous thigh-high boots, the sorial marker of a lady of the night, are now as basic a wardrobe staple as flat. Even the term sex worker is emblematic of that shift. Pretty Woman and its reviews both uses hooker pretty liberally, a label that feels shockingly out of date today. All in all, this makes for more lightning rod than male director Garry Marshall probably originally expected of a movie that spends so much time on Rodeo Dry in the post-Hashmay to context the scenes between Vivian and Philip Stuckey. Richard's gross lawyer, who assumes he has a free pass due to her profession, feel more modern than ever after finding out that Richard's date has been hired to play that role. Stuckey repeatedly makes sexual comments to her, implying that he too might want to pay for her services, and eventually tries to sexually assault her, here too. Roberts' performances sell her body language, which has her almost folding in on herself, as if hoping that taking up as little space as possible will dissuade this man from touching her, is instantly recognizable to any woman who has been in a similar situation in other ways. However, the film is woefully limited. The dangers faced by sex workers, addressed early on, specifically in one scene where Vivian walks through an alley and she sees a group of cops pulling the body of a woman she knows out of a dumpster. This prompts Kit to wonder if she and Vivian should consider working for a pimp, someone who could technically protect them. Vivian refuses, repeating their shared mantra. We say who? We say, when we say how much it's a scene that reminds me of a more recent one, an HBO series, The DU, in which Candy explains that she won't work with the pimp because she wants the freedom of working alone and keeping her profits for herself like Vivian and Kit. That's a luxury that Candy enjoys as a white woman who technically has other options to fall back off. And while Pretty Woman, hence at the darker side of this arrangement, the duo actually took pains to show us the violent strain flip side of Candy's so-called Freedom Vivian's rag to riches story largely depends on her ability to pass her relationship. With Thompson, who treats her with respect from the start, evolves the way it does because he sees her potential. She's a beautiful white woman who has the ability to blossom into our cultural ideal, that famous class-fixated scene, where Vivian returns to the Rodeo Drive shop that snubbed her only works within that context. If she were a woman of color, no matter how well dressed, the reaction from the salesperson would have been vastly different. This fits in with a legacy of limiting the face of sex work and any other kind of supposedly morally transgressive behavior in pop culture to acceptably white, acceptably attractive women, the girlfriend experience in The Secret, Diary of a Call Girl, or other examples of this trend. Still, The Deuce is an exception. The creators George Pelecanos and David Simon made the effort to hire female directors and writers to root the show in women's experiences rather than through the perspective of the men around them. Male director Marshall doesn't avoid this male gaze trap, as, effectively, Vivian's feelings and everyday struggles are mostly glossed over once she moves into Richard's suite, and we really only see her as others, men like Richard Stuckey and Barney Thompson, the Regent Beverly Wiltshire Dapper, manager, see her something to be tamed and or won over an object. The fact that women have claimed her as their own in the years since the film's release has more to do with the strength and honesty of Robert's portrayal of Vivian than Marshall's vision of her. The movie's premise is still controversial. It most certainly requires a healthy dose of suspended disbelief. But love it or hate it, its cultural impact is undeniable. I suspect the reason behind Pretty Woman's continued appeal as it's aged the movie screams of a kind of late 1980s, early 1990s consumerism that firmly dates it. Pirations are rooted in a more fundamental version of the American dream. Vivian's outfits may be back in style, and if her salmon-colored Bermuda laser combo just happened to find itself in my closet, I would not object. But the gender dynamics portrayed in the film certainly are not. But knowing that and having that hindsight allows the audience to sit back and just enjoy something that we might feel we have to find issue with today. But most of all, it remains popular because fighting with this movie is to rob oneself of some true viewing pleasure. The soundtrack, including the Roy Orbison classic that gave the movie its name, is bopping, and the pacing is bort. Breezy Gere is charismatic, and he and Roberts have a subtle chemistry, a complicity that you want to share, and really who can steel themselves against the D-like charm of Hector Alzando. If this movie were made in 2018, Vivian wouldn't need or want a man to save her. Maybe the story would be written or directed by a woman. And focus on Kit Duca, the girl who got left behind when her friend ascended to the ranks of the 1%. But hey, Hollywood loves a sequel, so Kit, I'm rooting for you. Pretty Woman, too. Cinder and Della has a nice ring to it. Pretty Woman is available for rental on iTunes and Amazon Prime. This movie, directed by Gary Marshall, written by J.F. Elton, produced by Arnon, Milchan, Stephen Reuther, Gary W. Goldstein, starring Julia Roberts, Richard, Dear Ralph Bellamy, Jason Alexander, Hector Elizondo, Laura S. Chomo, Alex Hyde. White cinematography, Charles Minsky, edited by Roger Nell, Priscilla Nett. Music by James Newton Howard. Production companies, Touchstone Pictures Silver. Screen partners Ivor Regency International Pictures, distributed by Buena Vista. Pictures distribution. Release date March 23, 1990. Running time 119 minutes. Country United States, language English. Budget $14 million. Box office $463.30.